Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Sunday School. This is the segment of the Pat Flynn Show where we dive a little bit deeper into philosophy and theology. Still getting my bearings set here in Wisconsin, so I promise I've gotten a couple of notes and emails and pings on social media about when are we going to resume the C.S. Lewis series of going through Mere Christianity, and the answer is this week. We're going to pick that back up this week. On today's episode, I want to actually comment on a video, a very recent video. This came out today. This was an interview on the Ben Shapiro show, and I was very interested in this because the person he is interviewing is somebody who has had a significant influence on me and the way that I think. His name is William Lane Craig. Now, the thing I kind of actually like about, and I don't watch a lot of these sort of YouTube, internet talk shows like Shapiro or Rogan or this or that. But what I appreciate about, well, at least both of those and a number of others, is they often have a very wide range of different thinkers and intellectuals. Not all of them are intellectuals, of course, but you get and Dave Rubin would be another example, a very wide range of people with very different opinions on things. And I think that is valuable because it helps us to weigh arguments and increase in understanding and so on and so forth. So while there have been many, many people on Rubin and Shapiro and Rogan, which I would have deep and fundamental disagreement with, it's always useful to expose yourself to people who obviously don't hold the same opinion as you, evaluate their arguments, weigh the position, because your mind might change, as actually my mind has changed over the years. And William Lane Craig, who is we'll get into some detail about who this guy is a Protestant philosopher and theologian, and he is somebody who I believe has just done really, really good work in the fields of natural theology, and providing an historical basis to argue for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I mean, he has done very, very good scholarly, technical work. Now, a lot of people aren't familiar with that because they see him, on a kind of a popular level. He's very well known for his, debates at various universities and stuff like that, and being very good at debates. He is a trained debater, so he's probably, not only do I think he has good argument potent there, and that he's both a technically skilled debater, and I think he has good arguments. So I wanted to comment on this video from a couple different angles and perspectives. One is I dropped the comment on the actual video, and it's currently the top comment, and some of the responses are very funny. And I more or less just shared my own story of saying, hey, as a former atheist, I used to fall for a lot of these kind of slogans. I said new atheist slogans, but they're really old atheist slogans as well. And to be perfectly fair, I never really found the new atheists all that interesting or compelling. Anyways, I kind of cut my teeth on the old atheists like Nietzsche and Russell and Sartre. For those of you who remember, I was influenced kind of very early on by a writer named H.L. Mencken. And he kind of led me to, Mencken is interesting. First off, he's a really fun, if you remember, I was influenced kind of very early on by a writer named H.L. Mencken. And he kind of led me to, Mencken is interesting. First off, he's a really funny and interesting writer. Most people have forgotten about him, but he was quite a cultural force back in his day. And he wrote the first, I think, English work on Nietzsche. And so he kind of led me to Nietzsche, and then I just spent so much time in these old atheists. And I never spent a lot of time in the new atheists because I just never found them, frankly, as good. They seemed very shallow. They seemed very angry and very petulant. So I kind of mentioned that in my comment a little bit, but I said that, as a former atheist, I used to kind of just assume a lot of these slogans that there's no evidence for the supernatural or that science has somehow refuted religion and, stuff that you would read in a lot of the new atheist books like The God Delusion. But then I also mentioned that, once, my atheism sort of collapsed in on itself, and and he was on Ben's show also, I'll link that. I think it was a really good interview. Then things suddenly began to change for me. And that's why I think shows like Shapiro can be valuable because, on one episode you'll see a new atheist, and on another episode you'll see Ed Feser, and you can weigh their arguments, and you can think, well, you can just say, well, who seems, Pat's still early, Pat can't talk yet, who seems more reasonable here? And the truth was, for a lot of my life, is I just didn't know that a reasonable case could be made for any particular religious viewpoint. It just never dawned on me that was even a possibility. And I think part of that was because I had been so shielded or put in my own little bubble of, of my sort of secular atheism, that I never even considered it. So, when I ran into somebody like William Lane Craig, and I first read some of his work or saw some of his debates and saw what a good job he did, it didn't convince me right away, but it opened me up to wanting to look a little bit further into things. And the more I did that, the more I got into both the sort of classic thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Boethius, Aquinas, and then moving through the contemporaries like Lonergan and Adler and Feser and Pruss and Rasmussen and Spitzer and all these guys. I mean, then it just became almost overpowering to me. I was like, these arguments are just really good, and they're just so much better that ultimately, well, my story, the rest is kind of history. So I dropped a comment there, saying that Craig was certainly influential for me, and that I have a lot of respect for him as a philosopher, theologian, even though we would have significant disagreements because he is a Protestant. So it might surprise him and possibly even alarm him to find out that his work, in part at least, led me to becoming Catholic, even though he himself is not a Catholic. But he's somebody that, even though we would disagree with on a number of things, I still obviously value his contributions enormously. So that's kind of my relationship or interest in William Lane Craig, is he was one of many different thinkers that began to sort of open my mind, and especially when I read his technical work. And I think this is very important to understand, is that you might see a YouTube video or a popular presentation, but this man has done an enormous amount of very technical, scholarly work on both philosophical arguments for God's existence and nature, historical arguments for the truth of Christianity. And if you really want to explore explore the depths of this, you have to roll up your sleeves, and you have to read his more technical literature, his actual published work, because you might see 2 or 3 sentences on one of his arguments in an interview here and come away with the idea of that, wow, that just seems really simple, that can't be all that convincing. But then you actually go and read the published work, and any one of his arguments might take 40 to 100 pages to fully develop and explore, and we'll get into some of those. And I think at best, a lot of these YouTube conversations, and I mentioned this in the comment, are only the beginning. So this is my final paragraph here. I say, YouTube conversations like these are only the beginning. If anybody here hasn't read the published work of Dr. Craig, especially the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, where you'll find him developing at length his Kalam cosmological argument, I highly recommend doing so. Dr. Craig is scholarly, honest, and convincing. So, I just wanted to drop a note for people. Now, we'll get into some of the comments, because there's some really, funny remarks, as is typically the case, and you wonder why I avoid, going around commenting and starting threads on social media. They are hardly ever productive, and it comes from both sides. I don't want to, be unfair or uncharitable here. It comes from both sides. It comes from all political parties. It's just something about online conversation where people have just really lost the art of the argument to be able to sit down and civilly kind of hash out their ideas, and that's a deep shame. So when I comment on social media, if I do, which is very rare, I'll usually just say, whatever I have to say, and then maybe I'll skim through once or twice, and if there seems to be something thoughtful or sincere, either in agreement or disagreement, maybe I'll provide a response, but then I have a policy online. It's one reply and that's it. I'm done. I can't waste any more. One reply and that's it. I'm done. I can't waste any more time than that. And that's what I did here. But let's talk about the interview a little bit, and I'll link it in the show notes for anybody who's interested. Craig is very well known for kind of being a philosophical lead-in to religion and Christianity in particular. He is most well known for kind of reviving what's known as the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, this is the argument for the existence of God as the creator of the physical universe, of space-time reality, more or less. And it's a very simple argument in its presentation, although it can, like I said, it can get quite technical when you really want to develop it and defend it in length. And he presents it, obviously, in a sort of brief or truncated form. You can't, you could do a series of lectures on this one argument, but obviously that's not the purpose of an interview. Let people to the general idea. So funny enough, this type of argument was rejected by people like Thomas Aquinas. So people often get these arguments confused. So the Kalam cosmological argument goes like this. It says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's the first premise. The universe began to exist. That's premise number 2. And then the conclusion, which follows from that necessarily, is just that the universe has a cause. And then you can sort of unpack what it would mean to be a cause of the universe. It would have to be something immaterial, timeless, spaceless, extremely powerful. So you can actually sort of pull out a lot of the divine attributes, if you will, of what it is to be God just from this very simple argument. Now, it doesn't give you Christianity. It could give you a deism or something like that, but it certainly gives you, if you believe the argument is successful, it gives you a transcendent class. And of course that fits in, very, very easily with the great monotheistic traditions, a transcendent God. So it kind of rules out pantheism, it rules out polytheism, it rules out Thor and flying spaghetti monsters and all this stuff. So that's obviously a very ignorant, if you're thinking, well, why can't it be the flying spaghetti monster? Well, these types of arguments tell you why God can't be anything like that. Because the flying spaghetti monster, if he existed, maybe he does in some faraway part of the universe, who knows? He's got noodly appendages, he's floating around in time or space, so he's just not the type of thing that could be a cause of space-time reality. So it's just kind of like, that's like, if you're going to make an objection to this argument, don't make that one. It just shows that you've taken no time to even try and understand this type of argument. So the Kalam argument was not accepted by people like Thomas Aquinas. Now, when Aquinas argues for the existence of God, he said it's very different. It's actually hierarchical. It's kind of looking at being in more of a vertical sense of saying, well, why does anything exist right now rather than nothing? So Aquinas isn't concerned with, the universe having a beginning. In fact, for the sake of argument, he just conceded, well, even if the universe is eternal, even if it never had a beginning, it in principle must have some type of foundational reality, some basement to reality. This is the famous unmoved mover or uncaused cause argument. And I think that Ben actually gets this wrong in the interview, because he says to Craig that, he's making an unmoved mover argument, but that's technically that's a different argument than the Kalam argument that Craig is making. They're not the same. The unmoved mover argument goes to show that there must be some type of necessary, non-contingent, uncaused reality to explain the ex-nihilation of any physical reality here and now, of why anything is being here and now over nothing. So what the sort of Thomistic and Aristotelian type of arguments give you is that God is not just the creator of anything that exists, but the sustainer of it here and now at every moment in time. I think it's actually much more radical, and I actually think those arguments are more convincing. Contingency-like arguments, Thomistic-like arguments. I think that they're they're extremely powerful, even though they're more technical. I think the advantage of Craig's type argument is, even though it can get technical in its defense, is at least very simple to present at first. It's more accessible, kind of maybe to more of a lay audience. So I just wanted to point out that distinction, as I think even Ben makes the confusion. Craig's argument is not a classic unmoved mover argument, at least in the Aristotelian sense, like somebody like Phaser would argue for. It's a different argument that is arguing from the beginning of physics. Argue for. It's a different argument that is arguing from the beginning of physical reality, whereas Aquinas and Aristotle and contemporaries in that sort of school of thought will concede, at least for the sake of argument, that even if the universe was eternal, it's not the type of thing that can explain the existence of itself. It's not the type of necessary reality, pure actuality, as Aquinas would hold, that can explain why anything exists over nothing. So I know that might be immensely boring to a lot of you, but it was something that jumped out at me at the interview when Ben said that. So I think it's an important distinction not to mix these arguments up. They are technically different. Now, Craig's argument, I think, is still a good argument, and I think that maybe if Aquinas were around today with what we know now, with the scientific confirmation of the beginning of the universe, he might have been more sympathetic to it. But it's just what that premise is not. He's not saying that everything has a cause. That would be problematic. Because then we would have to wonder, well, what caused God? Did God cause himself? Well, that seems not possible, because then God would have to exist before he existed to cause himself. And so it sounds like self-causation is absurd. Like, that can't be the case. So that's not what this argument is saying. What the argument is saying is that anything that comes into being, anything that begins to exist, has a cause. Now, obviously, when we get to God and we see him as a necessary reality, he is not the type of thing that is even in need of a cause, not even in principle, because God is immaterial, timeless, spaceless, eternal, right? So he's necessarily existing. He exists through himself. He is, as Lonergan would have it, an unrestricted act of mentation or understanding. God is the sole ultimate reality. So to ask what caused God, ultimate reality. So to ask what caused God is to say, well, what caused the uncaused cause of the universe? It's actually a nonsense question. When you understand what we mean by God and necessary reality, you'll see why that type of objection is just really misaimed, and it doesn't understand the nature of these arguments. But that is a very common objection. It's certainly not a good one, but it's one that you constantly hear, both on a popular level and even among certain philosophers who really should know better. So you have to be very careful. The first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause. And I think Craig probably should have highlighted that a little bit more, because it's such a common misunderstanding. And in my conversation with Ed Phaser, he thinks this is a huge pet peeve of his. He addresses it at some length. I'll link to our conversation in the show notes, but I just wanted to point that out. So I mean, that first premise is as plausible as anything that out. So I mean, that first premise is as plausible as anything can possibly get. I mean, we have no experience of things coming into being without a cause. The world doesn't act like we probably would if things could just pop into being uncaused. Like, nobody expects that just, sitting at home watching TV, a moose or a hippo is going to just pop into your living room without a cause. And if it did, you would think, well, how did that get there? What caused that? Was it teleportation, or was it a cloaking device, or what? So to even kind of try and argue the first premise, and Craig in the interview says that any sincere seeker of truth really doesn't try to deny the first premise of this argument, is really tantamount to denying the principle of sufficient reason, which would really undermine pretty much all of science and philosophy to begin with. So It's really, I think, a very desperate attempt when you start trying to attack the first premise of this argument, truth as it gets. Now, the second premise, that the universe began to exist, I think it enjoys, and Craig will give you all the technical development of this if you pick up the Blackwell Companion of Natural Theology. It enjoys both strong philosophical and scientific support. So, from philosophy, kind of a simple way to think about this is, does infinite past time make sense? And I don't think it does, because when we think of the word infinite, we think of something that's unachievable. That's what infinite means. There's always, plus one more that you could go. But then when we think of past time, we think of something that's been achieved, right? That's what past time means. So when we say infinite past time, we're really saying like an unachievable achievement. We've achieved the unachievable. It seems like it's an outright logical contradiction, right? But then other thought experiments can get us there too. We can, like if somebody walked up to you and said, "Hey, guess what? I just got done counting down from infinity." You'd be like, "Well, that can't be right. Maybe you just got down counting down from a very, very large number, but." Like, how could you, like, that doesn't seem at all possible. How could you be just finished counting down from infinity? So trying to traverse an infinite backward series of causal events seems like a fundamental absurdity or contradiction. So I think we have strong philosophical reasons to think that past time is finite. But then we have enjoy strong scientific consensus on this as well from modern Big Bang cosmology, that some 13.8 billion years ago, the universe, all of space-time, all of physical reality sort of winked into existence. So certainly I think that the second premise is on very solid ground. A multiverse scenario doesn't get you out of this. Currently, through like the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, the best scientific evidence we have for the beginning of the universe, even if a multiverse existed, would still have a beginning. So it might kick the problem back a step, but doesn't get around it, and you still have to deal with the philosophical arguments as well. So from both a philosophical approach and scientific approach, I certainly think that second premise is quite strong, certainly far more plausible than its alternative. And then from that, it just follows logically and necessarily that the universe has a cause, and so you would sort of have to figure out, well, what could cause all of physical reality, and again, in his technical work, Craig draws us out, in some detail of, okay, well, whatever created all of space and time must be beyond space and time. What all of created matter and energy must be beyond matter and physical reality. And again, in his technical work, Craig draws us out, in some detail of, okay, well, whatever created all of space and time must be beyond space and time. What all of created matter and energy must be beyond matter and energy. And you kind of like get down to like two options, right? Like, okay, so whatever is this sort of uncaused cause of all the causes that exist, of all physical reality, it could either be an abstract object, like the number 7 or the essential properties of the person Meatloaf, or it could be an unembodied mind, an unrestricted act of mentation or understanding. And here, I think it's a pretty obvious answer. Abstract objects, if they exist apart from minds at all, which is certainly arguable, don't cause anything. That's just what abstract objects are. They're causally effete. So we only have one other alternative. So that is the Kalam argument, still in a very truncated, and because it's so simple in its face, a lot of people kind of dismiss it. But when you actually take the time, when you roll up your sleeves, like I said, and you study this argument, and you kind of follow it to the end of the rainbow, I think it's a good argument. I do. I think it's a good argument. I think there's better arguments, but I think it's a good argument. He then presents the moral argument of how, which we've been talking about at some length in the C.S. Lewis series, because at the beginning of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis is actually presenting this very, very similar type of argument. Craig just kind of puts it in a more formal, he puts it in it's in the form of a syllogism, so it's much more direct, where C.S. Lewis is kind of, developing it a little bit more eloquently as he would do as a professional writer. But it's the same type of argument. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about that now, but it's an argument from moral ontology. And the idea is we all have this experience of objective moral values and duties. So how best do we explain that? Is that experience reliable? Is it pointed at something true? Or is this moral experience something that we've come to discover about the world, or is it something we've come to invent about the world? So Craig rightfully addresses, a common confusion from evolution that says that, we evolved to have this sense of morality. And he says, quite appropriately, that's called a genetic fallacy in logic, that by trying to explain how a person came to hold a belief, you have somehow shown that belief to either be true or false. And the truth and falsity of a belief is actually independent of how it came to originate. So, for example, maybe I came to hear about the Earth being round because I grew up in America, and I've never investigated it myself and somebody might say, well, look, you only believe the Earth is round because you grew up in America, but if you grew up in the olden times, you would think it's flat. And that actually might be true. That might be entirely true. But does that show that my belief is false? And obviously it doesn't. You have to evaluate the belief itself independently of how it came to originate. And what Craig points out is he says, hey, look, even if we came to evolve into this moral experience, that doesn't tell us whether we are discovering something that is true and real, or whether we're inventing something as sort of a useful fiction. You have to evaluate this independently. And then he gives a sort of argument from properly basic beliefs or warrant, and saying, look, we take as reliable and basic that, even if we came to evolve to discover the external world through our senses, we don't think that we're making any of that up. We don't think that that's utterly deluded or defeasible. So through our senses, we don't think that we're making any of that up. We don't think that that's utterly deluded or defeasible. So why should we be any more skeptical of our moral experience? It seems like unless there's some overriding defeater provided of that, then we are perfectly justified to hold to what pretty much everybody holds to anyways, that some things in this world are truly right and other things are truly wrong, that it doesn't matter. When we say objective, we mean that something is valid and binding, independent of human experience. So, my computer here is objective. It would be here even if I wasn't thinking about it. Even if even if Thanos snapped his thumb and evaporated me, my computer would still be here. It's not mind dependent. Whereas when we say that something is subjective, what we mean is that things are mind dependent most of the time. There's obviously ways that we can kind of quibble about definitions here, or we might be over blueberry sorbet, right? Now, it's objectively true that that's my personal preference, but it's still a sort of subjective preference. It's not that raspberry sorbet is objectively better than blueberry sorbet or something like that. But that isn't the type of experience we have with morality. And if we want to affirm, which pretty much everybody does, that some things like rape, murder, genocide are truly wrong, no matter how many people might think they're right, then we have to find some way to explain this ontologically. Like, what gives us the grounds to affirm the objectivity of moral values and duties? Because we all seem to believe and experience moral values and duties as objective. So how do we explain that? And the moral argument goes to show that there can be no naturalistic grounds for that we need a transcendent anchor point to get objective moral values and duties off the ground. Now, again, I'm not going to defend that or develop that at length. Formally presented, it's if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist, but objective moral values and duties do exist, and then therefore it follows that God exists as the best explanation for that. So if you want that, actually, if you want to go deeper into that argument, then I invite you to go back and return to the C.S. Lewis series as we read through Mere Christianity, and I kind of formalize his argument. I kind of show how he's developing this argument and supporting that. I think it's an extremely powerful argument. I think it's an extremely good argument and it was an argument that really affected me. It's also an argument that people get wrong a lot. because they're saying, well, are you saying because, if I don't believe in God that I'm not a good person? That isn't what the argument is saying at all. It has nothing to do with personal behavior. It's much more radical than that. It's that if God does not exist, there is just no such thing as good, bad. The argument is saying at all. It has nothing to do with personal behavior. It's much more radical than that. It's that if God does not exist, there is just no such thing as good, bad, right or wrong to begin with at all. It's an ontological, not an epistemological argument. Obviously, people who believe in God would and should affirm that people of various religions, belief or unbelief, can still be very decent human beings. That's not what the argument is saying. So I want to make sure that we don't get confused on that. So go back, check out the series I'm doing on C.S. Lewis, because he gives I think a very formidable presentation of this type of argument in the first couple chapters of his book, which I read through and then offer some commentary and development on. Now, what I think is very interesting about this conversation, and I give Ben credit here. Ben is an Orthodox Jew. He brought on William Lane Craig, who has done serious, significant and scholarly work on of the historical data points that are extremely difficult to affirm, if not impossible to affirm, without the resurrection being there to explain them. Facts like the honorable burial of Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of the empty tomb by women followers, the postmortem appearances to various individuals and groups across various times, locations, and circumstances, and then the sudden and severe origin of Christian belief, of belief in the resurrection. And these facts enjoy a very strong consensus among historians, which William Lane Craig points out. So really what the question comes down to, and what he presses Ben on, is, well, how best do you explain these? Because it seems like hallucination doesn't do it, because that doesn't cover the post-mortem appearances adequately. Groups don't have hallucinations, plus these appearances happen to both believers and unbelievers, friends and enemies, so it fails at that. But it also doesn't explain the empty tomb or the other important historical facts. Neither does conspiracy, neither does swoon theory, and you just go down the line and you realize that all these naturalistic explanations fail pretty miserably in terms of explanatory power, explanatory scope, their plausibility, and they also tend to be somewhat contrived and ad hoc, which means they don't really meet historical criteria for being a good explanation at all. But obviously, the resurrection does. First off, it's what the people who really started Christianity have believed all along. So it's certainly not ad hoc. It's not something we're sort of writing back into the history of Christianity. I mean, that is the history of Christianity. But certainly, if you already have the existence of God, if you're already a theist, then there's no a priori. And then when I think you consider the religious and religio-historical context at the time, and when you think about God philosophically and you ask questions like, well, is God interested in us? Does he seem like the type of God that might want to reveal himself, that might want to get involved in human history? You can, in support of the historical evidence for the resurrection, I think you can build an extremely powerful probabilistic case as well, and philosophers like Richard Swinburne do this. Now, Craig doesn't take that approach, but I think adding that approach makes it even more powerful. And the reason I said I give Ben credit is, Craig is quite forceful on his delivery of this. So this is obviously a huge point of disagreement. Now, at first, Ben kind of pushes back on Craig, and he says, well, look, the Jewish conception of the Messiah is sort of radically was and is radically different. And Craig affirms that. He says, yes, of course it is. Jesus was not sort of radically was and is radically different. And Craig affirms that. He says, yes, of course it is. Jesus was not what the Jewish people were expecting. And then he kind of pushes it forward, and he says, the reason, so why should we accept, Christ's claim as Messiah? Why should we accept his interpretation rather than everybody else's? And he brings it down, rightfully, I think, to the resurrection. The resurrection seems like a divine sign-off. It's God saying, yes, this is correct. So if we have good reason to believe in the resurrection, coming off our prior conditional and probabilistic belief in God, it seems like Christianity is true. And that's what convinced me. That's what ultimately got me. So Ben's dispute seems not to be historical in nature, or at least he didn't press it from a historical angle. It was really a theological, which I agree. Like, if we were just making theological arguments, that would probably be difficult to solve one way or another. I'm sure you could give good arguments either way. But it seems like the hinge point, which it has always been for Christianity, is the resurrection. Did this super miracle actually occur, or did it not? And that not, I think, only solves the dispute in that context, but it just solves the dispute universally. I mean, if like it's that's it, right? If we can have the grounds for the resurrection, solid historical, philosophical grounds for it, it seems like Christianity is true, at least in some form. It doesn't get us to any denomination. That's a further set of questions there, which I've explored in other episodes. But what Craig does, I think, very well is he kind of like makes just the fewest number. As a minimalist, I appreciate this. He makes just the fewest number of moves that you need to move into a reasonable Christian belief. He starts moves that you need to move into a reasonable Christian belief. He starts with arguments for the existence of God, which get you in their cumulative case, right, from Kalam arguments, fine-tuning arguments, moral arguments, get you to a moral monotheism. And what that does is it sort of narrows your option of possibly true religions to pretty much the great Abrahamic traditions and maybe some forms of Hinduism. And then what he does is he just presses straight to the question of Christ. Who do you think Christ was? What do you make of his claims? And do we have good evidence for the resurrection? So if you can just make those two moves, and I think Craig is very, very wise about this. What he doesn't want is people getting held up on issues that are probably very secondary, interpretations of Genesis or certain, possibly difficult passages in the Old Testament. He doesn't want people getting held up on those because they don't seem to be the problem. I'm saying it's a lot more important if you already think that Christianity is true. Then it becomes, I think, quite important. But if you don't think Christianity is true, then it's hard to see why it's important at all. So at best, they seem to be very secondary in nature. And I think what Craig has done is he's sort of made a very clear path of the steps that a person can really investigate. It's sort of the minimum effective Christianity, if you will. It's close to a mere Christianity, like C.S. Lewis. And it was certainly influential and helpful for me. So that's why I was, glad to see him present this. So why don't we look at some of the comments here that came in under my comment. Maybe we'll take one or two and just sort of since I'm not going to go through and answer all these. God help me if I did something like that. It's Mother's Day after all. Happy Mother's Day, everybody. So the first comment, somebody asked, well, what specifically changed my mind? And I gave a book recommendation, so I didn't leave him completely hanging there. But as I explained to this guy, it wasn't any one particular argument, right? It's not like I just saw one debate or read one book and my mind switched overnight. It was really a cumulative study. And I didn't become a Christian at first right away either. I had to kind of work my way down. Spent a lot of time in natural theology. Then you kind of have to switch hats and take off the philosopher hat, or at least keep that on and put the historian hat on aside from that. So not only, I always had this sort of the kind of background in philosophy, but I learned a lot about history and the historical method by really investigating Christianity. It was a very fruitful study to me. But I said that, once my sort of atheism collapsed in on itself, I really went back and gave other thinkers a fair shot who I never really. Christianity. It was a very fruitful study to me. But I said that, once my sort of atheism collapsed in on itself, I really went back and gave other thinkers a fair shot who I never really at least seriously considered before, starting with Plato, going up through Aristotle, Boethius, Aquinas, and then moving to the contemporaries like Phaser, Stump, Adler, Lonergan, Spitzer, Pruss, all those guys. And then I also said, well, I'll give a nod to C.S. Lewis because even though his books are on more of a popular level, he does present his arguments very well and certainly should open a person up to wanting to go deeper on them, which is why I have been enjoying reading through C.S. Lewis on the podcast. And Lewis himself was an atheist, so he was somebody who was not religious for a very long time, and then through philosophical and historical investigation himself came to be a Christian, and then of course that deeply influenced a Catholic, and he helped Lewis to see that Christ was the myth that actually happened, the myth that really came true. It's a fascinating story if you've never looked into Lewis's conversion experience. But then, of course, he becomes a very well-known Christian writer in a very direct sense, writing books like Mere Christianity and Miracles. And these are very good books. Lewis was a serious thinker. He was a serious philosopher, but also a great writer. So if you haven't read Lewis, give him a shot, honestly, because his work is extremely enjoyable, because he's obviously one of the best writers, certainly that I've ever read. His style, he's just so good. His use of analogy, his dialogue, everything. I mean, he's just one of the best. So you combine his writing abilities with his philosophical abilities, and it's hard to find a modern day C.S. Lewis as somebody who's got both of those chops. Okay, let's take this guy's comment. I think it's his writing abilities with his philosophical abilities, and it's hard to find a modern day C.S. Lewis as somebody who's got both of those chops. Okay, let's take this guy's comment. I think it's interesting. It's obviously disagreeing with me and not all that friendly, but that's fine. We can deal with that. I'm a grown-up. This comes from our friend Psychedelic Visionary. He says, Pat Flynn, you turn to religion because you're afraid. We as a human species know nothing. We then stuff our mouths with McDonald's and poop and pee. He doesn't use those words. And you think you're special. So let's just stop it right here. Because once we get like 4 lines into this, I don't even know if it's worth continuing forward. So let's just take this critically. So he starts out with an ad hominem. So rather than addressing any of my actual comments, or rather than providing an argument, he just attacks the character of somebody he doesn't know. But here's the thing. We could even grant that. Say I turn to religion because this is a similar type of fallacy. This is a Freudian type of fallacy that even if it was correct, wouldn't settle the debate. Maybe I did turn to religion because I was completely cowardly. Or maybe I turned to atheism because I had a messed up relationship with my dad, or whatever psychological reason you want to give there. But do either of those explanations tell you whether or not theism or atheism is true? And the answer is obviously not. It's just, it's not only fallacious, but in this account, it's certainly kind of an ad hominem, because I think he's just trying to accuse me of being cowardly. I don't think that I'm cowardly, but even if I was, that would mean nothing. So he's kind of like doubly fallacious here. But then he says this: we as a human species know nothing. Now this is deeply ironic, because first off, he claims to at least know 2 things. He claims to know that religion is false and that I'm afraid. So do we know nothing? And he also claims to know that we know nothing. The claim to know nothing is a claim to know at least something. So he's just so deeply mired in contradiction with this initial statement. And then he says something about stuffing ourselves with McDonald's and eating and pooping and then thinking that I'm special. But then he says the reality is life is beautiful but cruel. Every day we get older and we get wrinkles and pains and surgery and cancer, and then we'll be lowered into the ground eaten by maggots. So we know nothing, but this guy claims to know a whole lot. Now he doesn't give any arguments for this. He's just making a bunch of assertions. And you wonder why I don't like to engage in social media comments, because this is so extremely typical and disappointing. There is just nothing of any type of value, consistency, or sincerity. This appears to me to be, unfortunately, just an emotional tirade. Now, it doesn't upset me. I get nasty comments all the time. I'm used to it. But it does sadden me and disappoint me, because here's somebody who's so in the grips of his. I don't know if he's an atheist, but certainly he's repulsed by religion, and it's hard to have a conversation who's so emotionally reactive with somebody on anything, but especially really. And I think that saddens me. You know, he can say anything he wants about myself, but I think that this man is missing out on something beautiful, on something wonderful, and something true. And I would want him to experience that, because as nasty as he wants to be to somebody he doesn't know online, I care about this person. I care deeply about everybody. So that is frustrating to me. I can take the insults. That's fine. I get those all the time. That really doesn't bother me. And then of course people kind of pile on him, and it turns into a big mess. But is there even any somebody says we're in a computer simulation and this or that? We talked about the computer simulation argument with on the episode I did with Sam and Alex, and why that is not a good explanation. And we can argue that out through the philosophy of mind by showing that whatever consciousness is, it's not reducible to purely or fully explainable by purely physical processes alone. And a computer, being just a physical thing, could not appropriately produce, support, or explain conscious experience. So we can argue against the computer. We can argue against the computer. First off, you want to talk about like various levels of evidence, right? And we just went through some for an immaterial, timeless, spaceless mind as being the creator. That would rule out the computer simulation. We have the arguments for the truth of Christianity. That would rule it out. But we can also rule it out by a deep study of philosophy of mind. Like atheistic or agnostic, public intellectuals. Neil deGrasse Tyson comes online, and he's so against religion and the idea of God. But then there was a conference where somebody asked him, like, what do you think the chances are we're in a computer simulation? And he said he thought that it's very high or something. And I'm like, well, that is just like alarmingly surprising to me, because here's a guy who says, go where the evidence leads, but on what planet, like, do we have more evidence that we're living in a computer simulation rather than in a theistic universe? That's just a conversation I would like to have. It just seems like this is a retreat that certain people take because they know there are a great many things about the physical universe that the natural sciences cannot exhaust by themselves. And that obviously a rich philosophical theism can very adequately explain. But we don't want to go there. God forbid we go to God, right? Exhaust by themselves. And that obviously a rich philosophical theism can very adequately explain. But we don't want to go there. God forbid we go to God, right? Right. God forbid we take the turn that we've been trying to avoid. But a computer simulation. Yes. Well then who's to say that the computer simulation wasn't, just made by a bunch of Mormons and we're actually in a Mormon universe, or was it made by a bunch of Christians and we aren't in a Christian universe? So like you can't even escape it there. It's just such a silly alternative. It's so hard to take it seriously. But there's a lot of people who kind of throw this out there without it being well reasoned. Usually the thing that they say is, well, we can't prove that we're not in it. And I actually think we can strongly argue against it, again, from arguments already given in philosophy of mind. So even that isn't a good argument. But there's a number of things that we might not necessarily be able to prove aren't the case, but are obviously quite silly to assume. Even that isn't a good argument. But there's a number of things that we might not necessarily be able to prove aren't the case, but are obviously quite silly to assume. Maybe I can't technically prove that I'm not a moth having a dream that I'm a pig being stimulated in a vat as a brain by a mad. Maybe I can't prove that. But is anybody seriously going to entertain that as an option for reality? I mean, come on. Certainly it's not parsimonious. Anyway, so I think that's probably good. These comments will grow, so if anybody wants to go in there and I'm looking through, it looks like there's even more. It's probably not going to be pretty. It's YouTube. It always gets nasty, but you know what? I was the spirit moved me to, so to speak, to put a comment on there. So they were. You know what? It's kind of interesting because maybe I'll do it more often, because if nothing else, it gives us some interesting material to talk about, even if it's not always. I hope you found this conversation enjoyable in its own right, whether you agree with it or not. And I will link the conversation with Bill Craig, so you can watch that yourself. Like I said, I don't agree with him on everything. I'm sure we would have significant disagreements on a number of things, but I wanted to give him a nod of appreciation for the work he has done as a philosopher. And, he was one influential player in the development of my thinking, certainly not the only one. So it was, I was happy to see him get a hearing. Let's say he's kind of a hidden, like, if you're really into philosophy, you probably know who he is, but he's certainly not like popular. He's not somebody who's exceedingly well known. So it was kind of cool. Same thing with Ed Feser, right? I was very excited when Ed Feser was brought on the show because, I mean, who really knows who that guy is? But I think he's somebody that everybody should know. Everybody should know because I think he's a great thinker. So I'll link both of those episodes in the comments. In the show notes if you want to get a little more context to this. But otherwise, yeah, have an awesome Sunday. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoy Sunday School, if you like what we're doing on the Pat Flynn Show, please consider supporting by leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. 5-star reviews really do help the show. I'm going to read a few more next week. I'd love to give you...
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.